Hello everyone, welcome to session 5 of LTEC 676, Social and Ethical Issues in Educational Technology. In today's video, we're going to cover 3 topics. First, I want to discuss our upcoming office hours. Then I want to travel back in time to take a look at EdTech in the 1980s. And finally, we'll end today's video by reviewing equity and equality issues regarding computers from the 1980s. So let's get started. Now, as you all know, office hours are required for session 5. Now, I know most of you have already signed up. There's nothing to prepare. These are really just informal get-to-know-you sessions. We'll be using my Zoom room in order to meet, unless you are here on campus and want to meet face-to-face. The sessions will last about 20 minutes. There's nothing you need to prepare in advance. But of course, if you have questions about the course content or structure or the readings, feel free to bring those. I'm really looking forward to getting to know all of you. Now, this week we're continuing Unit 1, which is focusing on technology and equity in schools. And I constantly want to be reminding us of our central question, which is, what should an educator know about educational technology? And just to refresh our memories, last week we talked about the role of technology and equity. In particular, we looked at the illustrated analogy of the children watching the baseball game, and we focused on the inequities inherent in the ground and in the fence. With this analogy in mind, we asked ourselves, what and where is technology in general, and educational technology in particular in this illustrated analogy? And really what we're trying to get at is, what is the impact of technology in terms of equity? So what I want to do now is we're going to go back in time and we're going to look at some educational technology in the 1980s. So to do that, I want to set the stage of the 1980s. Now, some of you may not have been born, but many of you may have grown up in the 80s. And of course, if you don't know, electronics were a major aspect of life in the 1980s. Here's a short clip about the top 10 things that defined the 80s. And number 3 in that list were electronic innovations.
Big hair, big money, big foreign policy change, big groundbreaking technology. Video killed the radio star. Video killed the radio star. The 80s saw America become a greater superpower with all the spoils that go with it.
Nintendo, the world's #1 game system.
Number 3, electronic innovations.
The personal system 2. Will this be a major event in personal computing history or just another new product introduction?
The 80s proved a prominent decade for electronics development. The video game market had been left in tatters following a 1983 crash, but in 1985, Nintendo introduced the NES to North America and erased any memory of it. The console's quality design and impressive library revitalized video gaming. In the computer world, IBM introduced their first PC in 1981. Competitors were blown away, and its engineering became standard, paving the way for the dominance of PCs.
And while the rest of the clone makers have been struggling and agonizing over how to move to 32 bits, IBM now has done it. And I think the other people that make machines in the desktop area are going to have to follow that.
And of course, in 1983, Time magazine had this cover showing the personal computer with the tagline, "The computer moves in." And personal computer sales really began to skyrocket. So you can see here, really starting in 1982, sales of all kinds of different computers really increased dramatically. And of course, with these sales of personal computers, computers moved into US schools at an unprecedented rate for a new technology. So if we take a look at the picture here on the left, here's a quote from an article that says, during the 1980s, public school systems and universities across the US threw themselves headlong into the PC revolution, investing hundreds of millions of dollars in computer systems, accessories, and software. And soon it became common for most schools to assemble their expensive new computers in one place for group instruction. and thus was born the computer lab. And then on the right, this particular article highlights the relationship between technology companies and the education system. In this case, it happens to be the Apple. So you may be wondering, how were computers used in schools? Well, it's not much different than it is today in some respects. There were actually multiple streams of computer use. So number one, you had computers being used across the curriculum. And this is the idea that you could use a computer in different subject areas. A second aspect of use was actually focusing on computer science. How do computers work? How do you program them? Another aspect of computer use was programming in mathematics. The idea was that students might be able to learn math more efficiently and effectively by learning programming. Another use of computers in schools was using word processors, and this was typically done by secretarial students. There was also Logo, which some of you may have used before, and that was a computer programming language that was designed to teach children computer programming, but more importantly, problem solving. And then finally, there was also computer industry and business training in technical schools. So those were some of the ways computers were used in schools. Now, it's important to understand that there was also a reform initiative happening in the 1980s. And some of you may be familiar with the 1983 report called A Nation at Risk. And this publication is really encapsulated in this one quote, which starts out saying, "Our nation is at risk. Our once unchallenged preeminence in commerce, industry, science, and technological innovation is being overtaken by competitors throughout the world." And this really was sounding the alarm that the United States education system was not doing its job. And because of that, there was a flood of research conducted in the 1980s. And a lot of that research was focused on equity in school computer use. Now, why was that such a focus? Well, because of A Nation at Risk, there was concern over the inferior state of education in the U.S. There was a belief that the education system had to be reformed and that this reform had to focus on technological skills for all students. Another aspect of why equity was in focus was the realization that the United States was undergoing changing demographics. The workforce was increasingly consisting of women and people of color. And finally, there was a belief that computer competence was the fourth basic skill. Now, interestingly, these are all very much political and economic reasons for focusing on equity. The moral argument that equity should be a part of any democratic system was rarely made. Okay, so that kind of sets the stage. So what I want to do now is actually focus on a really impactful article that came out in 1991 and was written by Rosemary Sutton. The title of the paper was Equity in Computers in the Schools, A Decade of Research. And what she did was take a look at issues of equity in computers in schools by analyzing or summarizing all of the research that was conducted in the 1980s. So let's take a look at what she found. She argued that assessing equity and equality in schools is typically assessed in terms of inputs, processes, and outputs. Now, inputs have to do with what schools start with when educating students. And this includes financial information, physical and human resources. Now, measures of inputs typically include access to things, such as computers. Another area of focus was on process. And this is what happens within schools when students are educated. For example, how students are treated by teachers, what courses they're offered, etc. And measures of process typically involve the types of computer use, teacher attitudes towards computer use, and what kind of curricula were being used or developed in relation to computers. The third area has to do with outcomes. In other words, what are the results achieved by schools, such as standardized test scores, graduation rates, and college enrollment rates? And outcomes are often measured by student attitudes, and computer-related competencies around computer literacy or computer programming. So let's take a look at what Sutton found. Well, the first thing she looked at was inequalities in terms of access, and she found that there were class and racial differences. For example, in the early 80s, the mean ratio of elementary school students per computer varied. There was one computer for every 155 students in high SES or predominantly white schools. Now compare that to one computer to every 215 students in predominantly minority schools. There are also gender differences in terms of access, and data from 3 large surveys and several smaller state and local surveys indicated that there were small gender differences favoring boys in terms of access to computers in schools. And importantly, this pattern was not restricted to the US. In terms of school-related differences in access for boys and girls, there were also larger and more consistent differences in access at home. Regional and national studies found that families of male students were more likely to own a computer than families of female students. Boys were 3 times as likely as girls to attend a summer computer camp, and only 25% of participants in computer courses over a 3-year period were female. Now, there were also inequalities in terms of types of use. The 1981-82 NAEP Science Assessment found that 7% of students in Title I schools had taken programming. And just to refresh your memory, Title I schools are schools in areas that are considered low income relative to the average income of the local education agency. Compare that to 14% of students in non-Title I schools had taken programming. Data from another survey revealed differences in use related to drill and practice versus programming. 13% of the wealthier schools reported intensive drill and practice use versus 33% of minority schools. When it comes to programming, 21% of the wealthier schools reported intensive use in programming, whereas 10% of predominantly minority schools reported intensive use in programming. Now, Sutton points out, she says this means that low SES children who are disproportionately African American Hispanic were gaining most of their experience with a computer when it was in control, asking questions, expecting a response, and informing the student when he or she was correct. In contrast, the high SES students who are disproportionately white were gaining considerable experience when they were in control, giving the computer a series of instructions and observing the consequences of these instructions. As we see here, Sutton nicely summarizes this idea that the types of use surrounding computers can be drastically different. There were also gender differences in the types of use, which you can see summarized here. Girls were underrepresented at the elementary, middle, and high school levels in elective programming, game playing, and before and after school use. And programming classes at junior high schools and high schools in the mid-1980s were typically less than half female. There were also inequalities reported in teacher attitudes. The overwhelming majority of elementary teachers thought that the mastery of basic skills was the major benefit of computer use. Nearly 3/4 of Canadian elementary school teachers believed that drill and practice was effective in teaching students of low ability, but the responses were mixed on whether bright students were suited to drill and practice. There were also inequalities in curricula. Now, curriculum concerns related to equity focused on 2 areas: photographs in computer magazines and textbooks, and software design. Findings from analyzing the pictures and ads of popular computing magazines showed that only 31% of the illustrations included women or girls. In addition, women's roles in the pictures were much more likely to be passive than active, and 59% of all advertisements contained a lone male, and 90% of the men in those advertisements were white. Analysis of textbooks for computer studies were also analyzed. The majority of males were depicted making decisions, supervising, controlling robots, and fixing or using computers, whereas the females were portrayed passively, for example, handling input and output. There were also concerns about computer software design, and researchers found that there were obvious Eurocentric biases in early software. The classic example is that the early edition of the famous simulation/game Oregon Trail involved unprovoked attacks of the white settlers from American Indians. And there was also the emergence of quote-unquote girl software, special software designed specifically for girls. There were also inequalities found in student attitudes. Gender differences were found favoring males in a number of areas, including general attitude about computers, interest of computers, how much students liked computers, whether they thought computers were necessary or useful, and how confident they were using computers. No study during the 1980s reported more positive attitudes for girls. There were also racial differences as well. White children had more positive attitudes than minority children when it came to computers. There were also inequalities in terms of computer competence. Gender differences were found in computer competence in 7th and 11th grade students in regards to computer literacy. Of course, students who had more experience using computers were more competent in their knowledge about computers and in their use of computers. One study reported that pupils who had computers at home believed that more of their learning about computers was done at home than at school. No gender differences were found in programming competence in middle school, junior high school, or high school students. However, access to computers both in and out of school influenced performance. So why have we looked at all of this? Well, I wanted to share that summary of 1980s research with you because I want you to compare and contrast it with what Warschauer is reporting in his article from 2011. What aspects of equity do you think have changed? Have issues of fairness changed? Have issues of inclusiveness changed? And if so, in what ways? How? We'll continue to compare and contrast so that we understand how we got into the situation that we're currently in. Okay, everyone, we're out of time for today. I look forward to seeing you in office hours. In the meantime, I'll see you in Canvas. Have a great week.